A new president is going to confront some fairly tough medicine framed in those ways. And I think we got to get our minds out of that mindset, that what is necessary is really a revolution of innovation. And that is only going to come from government policy. This is the place where the United States really needs to take the leadership role, I think. We have the most productive economy in the world. We have the most, we don't have the most energy efficient economy in the world, but we have free capital markets. We have a great scientific base, and it's going to take driving change through the system at a rate that I guess I would consider on the scale of mobilization for World War II, something of that nature. It's going to take the concentration of using not just governmental resources, all of the resources of federal agencies that, and some of those are direct and regulatory, but others are the use of government agencies on the procurement side, et cetera, thinking about mobilizing all the assets of the government to take on the kind of change that Jay's talking about. That will only come, I think, with serious restraint by putting a price on carbon. That shifts us to a low carbon energy base. That has the potential for tremendous economic upside. We're feeling the tremendous economic downside right now of being addicted to high fossil fuel prices. We can turn that around, I think, but it's going to take imagination. It's going to take the work of the private sector. It's going to take the work of the scientific community, and it's going to take somebody. I think it's going to take a leader sort of calling the country to action on that. There's got to be, in addition to the cap and trade that has become the solution that's being debated in Congress, which would put an overall cap on the amount of carbon that can be emitted, and then gradually declining over the course of years, not anything like 80% by 2020, but the bill is 70% by 2050. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need a massive investment in alternative energy. That's going to require some tough decision making. For example, I think there's a huge potential to produce wind in the Middle West, in the Midwest, to produce concentrated solar in the Southwest, but that electricity is stranded right now. It has no way to get to market on the East Coast and on the West Coast, which means that we need to build out high-performance transmission lines. That's always been a very difficult sort of political matter in this country because you cross state boundaries, you cross state regulation. There are issues around siting and eminent domain questions that, compared to what Jay's talking about, seem like minor issues that we ought to be able to overcome, and yet they stall the political process. And it's going to only take top-level leadership from the business community, from the nonprofit community, from the religious community, and ultimately from at the presidential level that can blast through a system, the status quo, and give us that kind of virtuous cycle of innovation that the country needs, I think.
Kurt, let me just add one point that goes to Jay's point about how late we are in this process of the foreign policy implications, which is most of the discussion that we've been having today and most of the debate is about what technically people call mitigation. How do we reduce carbon? But because we're so far down the scale here, we're also going to have to start talking about adaptation. And one of the issues that's very important in our relationship with the developing world is a growing appreciation by us of the need to help those countries deal with what's already basically going to happen. We are going to have rising sea level. We are going to have droughts. We are going to have changes. And these countries are uniquely poorly positioned to do it. They're poor. They don't have strong infrastructure. And so we spend a lot of time talking about foreign aid and foreign assistance. A very important new component about our willingness to get these countries on board is going to be a much higher level of effort on our part, on Europe, Japan, and others, to support and help these countries which can't adapt well to these changes, to make this part of our own, meeting our obligations for what we've already done in terms of creating this climate problem.
And our record there is not that great. If you think about how we're responding to the food crisis in the world today and the rise up in prices, and what we're doing because of those, particularly because of the rise of transportation and the craziness of having to U.S. source the food exports, is that we're falling short even today on that scale. So the capacity to harness the American public in support of doing what Jim's doing is really a challenging problem.
I just want to give you guys a sense of one of the things that several of us on this panel have been involved in over the last couple of years. We've tried to structure a dialogue between two communities that spend remarkably little time with one another and speak very different languages. We brought some folks together from the climate community who think about these issues at a scientific level, and we also brought together some national security practitioners, Jim being the most prominent, and tried to sort of get the two groups to talk with one another. And initially it was quite a challenge. They speak different languages, have different expectations. We were asking national security guys, tell us exactly what to expect. A lot of caution, caveats from the scientific community. But over time, what I was struck by more than anything else is as we took this message out into the national security community, because there are so many pressing national security issues of the kind that Jim spoke about in terms of Iran and a rising China and Iraq and Afghanistan. If anything, I think the national security community, which is supremely positioned within our government to be able to make change and sort of argue for taking steps, this group is actually not as well informed about these issues as I think everyday Americans. In fact, I've found that as we've sat down and talked about these things, there's a lot of, well, are you sure? It seems to me there are a lot of debates on these issues, and so we've tried to kind of expose this group to these set of issues. I just want to say that, you know, from my perspective, the other issue is that because when we think a little bit about, like, you know, this progression, we are lured into believing that sort of climate and these effects will change gradually. But science and experience teaches us that we can really overnight suddenly be confronted by dramatic changes in climate, changes in currents, changes in weather patterns. In fact, one of the things that I think people don't realize is that we see this playing out on a daily basis. When you look up on the peaks here and you notice that the pines are dying, that's a consequence of climate change. The pine beetle is the change in climates. When you think about changes in fishing patterns, that's a consequence of changing currents and changing nature of carbonization within seawater. Lots of things are happening now. This is not something that our grandchildren are going to experience. It's going to be us and our children. I'm going to give Jim the last word, and then I want folks to start lining up with their questions, and I'm going to go to the audience. Jim.
Just two quick points. First of all, I think the national security community has in very recent years come to accept this as a very substantial problem and something they need to do something about. I co-chaired the policy panel of the Defense Science Board study last year on energy and defense. And the Defense Science Board had put out a very good study in 2001 about energy conservation and shifting away from petroleum and so forth, which was largely ignored. But this recent one, as well as the events of the last few years, have, I think, made real believers out of a lot of the uniformed military and the civilians and contractors and so forth and people who work with them. It's been, if you want to see the DSB report, it's on their website. It's called Less Fuel, More Fight. I also want to stress that oil needs to have its monopoly over transportation broken, shattered as quickly as we possibly can. It's not oil that needs to be broken, in a sense. It's the monopoly. Because OPEC, oil has a 96% monopoly over transportation. And OPEC is the oligopoly, essentially, really led by Saudi Arabia, that monopolizes oil. And that gives us puts us in a situation in which people have a lot of leverage over us. I mean, I feel almost personally humiliated having the American president have to go hat in hand to Saudi Arabia to please, 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 won't you give us a little bit more of your reserves pumped now instead of a few years from now. An analogy to what we need to do was done kind of accidentally at the end of the 19th century by the coming of the electricity grids and the possibility of large-scale refrigeration. For millennia, salt had been the only way you could preserve meat, a hugely important part of the human food chain. Salt had a monopoly, and indeed salt countries fought wars over salt mines up until the 1880s. Within a very few years, being able to freeze meat destroyed salt's monopoly. Now, salt, you had it on the breakfast table probably. Do you know where it came from? Do you care? Does anybody care? Are we salt independent? Who gives a damn? Right? It's just a useful commodity. Nobody lords it over his neighbor anymore because he has salt mines and his neighbor does not. That's what we need to do to oil.